Adaptation via natural selection. In this video, we're going to talk about how Darwin's ideas about natural selection cause adaptive evolution. So before we do that, let's talk about what Darwin saw that others didn't see that led him to thinking about evolution via natural selection. The first thing is he understood biogeography in a different way. And biogeography is the study of the distribution of plants and animals across the earth in space and time. And so when Darwin traveled around the world on the Beagle expedition, he was able to see very large patterns of how different species related to each other in space. Okay? And he saw that these patterns of similarity were ones where things that were closer to each other, things that were more geographically proximate, were more similar to each other than things that were more distant. And he realized that these patterns could be explained by evolutionary change. Probably the best known of these is the Galapagos Islands. So what we see here at the top of the slide is a set of finches that live in the Galapagos Islands, with one finch which is known now to be the ancestor of all the Galapagos finches. So the blue-black grassquit is the ancestor of all the Galapagos Island finches. And if you look at the map in the lower right-hand corner, what you can see is the relationship of the Galapagos Islands to Ecuador, which is where the blue-black grassquit is from. And so Darwin realized that one explanation for why these birds would be similar to each other and why they might diversify on the different islands within the Galapagos would be if there was some kind of common ancestry. And in fact, it was around this time that he drew a picture of what is known to be the first representation of a phylogenetic tree, that is, a graphical representation of how different species could be descended from one another. Now, this is just a hypothetical phylogenetic tree that he's created here. It does not represent any kind of real set of species. But he was sketching out for himself the way he thought things could be. And as you'll note at the very top of the page, you can see he wrote, "I think," and then he drew this phylogenetic tree. The other thing that Darwin realized was that natural selection would be a natural consequence of the overproduction of offspring by organisms. And he was led to this not by anything biological, but in fact by reading an economic paper by Malthus called the Essay on the Principles of Population. And what Malthus said was that human beings would always be in trouble in terms of having enough to go around because their populations would always exceed the resources available to them. And the quote you see down at the bottom is what Darwin wrote in his diaries or his notebooks after he had read Malthus. He says, "In being well prepared to appreciate the struggle for existence, which everywhere goes on from long continued observation of the habits of animals and plants, it at once struck me that under these circumstances, favorable variations would tend to be preserved and unfavorable ones destroyed. So the excess number of offspring allows for the variation to be selected amongst." And so this is where he gets the idea of natural selection, because there are too many organisms for the materials that are available for it in the environment. And so this is interesting. Remember from the first lecture, we talked about how before Darwin, variation was just something that was explained away. It was considered unimportant. Now, once we have a Darwinian idea of natural selection, variation becomes central to biology. It is absolutely necessary for evolution to take place, because without any variation, there's nothing for selection to act upon. And so we've completely reversed our ideas about variation and its importance in evolutionary understanding of life. Okay, so these next things are just a repeat of what I said on the previous slide. You can look at them at your leisure. And one critical thing that I didn't mention on the previous slide is that the variation must be heritable. If things are different simply because of non-heritable instances, then that is not going to lead to evolution. So remember the slide that I showed you in class of the people with different tan lines because of the different types of clothing that they wore. Those differences are forms of variation, but they're not heritable differences. The person that has a tennis tan could just as easily have had a water skiing tan if they'd been doing something different. All right, so let's look at adaptation via natural selection in terms of the critical features that it has. And there are 4 essential parts to adaptation via natural selection. First, species must have naturally occurring variation. Now, we're not going to answer where that variation comes from right now. We just assume that it exists. In other parts of the class, we'll talk about where variation actually comes from. And some of the variation must be heritable. That is, it must have an underlying genetic basis. The other thing that has to be true, and this is true for all organisms on the planet, is that they have the ability to produce more offspring than the environment can support. This is what leads to what Darwin called the struggle for existence. He did not, by the way, use the phrase survival of the fittest. In fact, this is a troubling phrase because it's led to some misunderstandings that we'll talk about in class. And then finally, you end up with natural selection. That is, if you have a particular environment in which individuals of a species live, some of the individuals that have particular traits, or what we technically refer to as phenotypes, will end up with higher survival and reproduction than individuals with other traits or other phenotypes. That's what natural selection is: differential survival and reproduction of individuals that have different traits. All 4 of these parts have to be there for adaptive evolution to take place. This, what you're looking at, is just a restatement of what I just said. You're welcome to read it on your own, but it just is another statement, in other words, of what we just said about natural selection and how it works. So what is evolution at its heart? At its heart, evolution is changes in gene frequencies in a population from one generation to the next. Because we have differential survival and reproduction of different phenotypes, what happens is the ones that survive at a higher rate leave more copies of the genes that produce their phenotype than the other types that live at a lower rate. And so what we're getting are changes in gene frequencies in a population from one generation to the next. Now, adaptive evolution is slightly different. Any kind of change in gene frequency in a population from one generation to the next will be evolutionary change. But adaptive evolution is a particular kind of evolution, and these are changes in gene frequency in populations that are actually caused by natural selection. That is, you're going to get differential survivorship and differential levels of reproduction because certain traits do better in particular environments. Okay. These 4 conditions that we talked about are all necessary, but each one on its own is not sufficient. In other words, all 4 of those aspects of evolution via natural selection must be there, or you will not necessarily have adaptive evolution. So, for example, you can have selection but without any adaptive evolution taking place. Suppose you have a clone of a plant that's growing out in the world so that all the individuals have the exact same genes, and some of the plants are bigger than others because they just happen to be living where there's more nutrients available. And so the bigger plants leave more offspring, and selection in that sense is favoring those bigger plants because they leave more offspring than the smaller plants, but no evolution is going to take place because all the individuals have the exact same set of genes, and so no gene frequencies are going to change. So we cannot have adaptive evolution if there's no variation that is heritable, if genetic variation is not present, like in the case of the clones, or if we have no differential survival and reproduction of the phenotypes. There will not be any kind of adaptive evolution. Now, Darwin was absolutely brilliant in coming up with this idea. It turns out to be correct. There's lots of experimental evidence showing that this is, in fact, how organisms' gene frequencies change over time when they undergo adaptive evolution. But there were things that Darwin didn't understand very well in his time, and that have only been cleared up later by later researchers. The first thing is that Darwin had no real understanding of genetics. He had some ideas about inheritance and how it might work, but they turned out to be completely wrong. And so in understanding the details of how selection operates on genes to produce changes in gene frequencies through generations, Darwin really couldn't provide any details about that, and it's been filled in by later researchers. Another thing that Darwin didn't do very well was explain the process of speciation, which I haven't really talked about a lot in this particular set of slides, but I do want you to be aware of the fact that he had some ideas about how speciation would take place, but they weren't really well fleshed out, and it was only later in the 20th century that people have figured out much more clearly how speciation takes place. He also couldn't explain the relationship between evolution and the development that takes place in an organism, and that's something that's the really active area of research right now.